Hey everyone, and welcome to this series of conversations with people who chose to speak out and ask difficult questions during the COVID era. At first glance, you might think this is a podcast about COVID. In reality, it's about something much bigger. It's about freedom of speech, intellectual honesty, and the right to question official narratives. It asks these fundamental questions. Do people have the right to challenge consensus? Is it ever justified to silence dissent in the name of public health, especially when those raising concerns are qualified to do so? And what kind of society do we become when fear replaces open dialogue? These conversations aren't telling you what to think. They're an invitation to listen with an open mind and an open heart. You may not agree with every viewpoint shared here, but we hope you'll agree on one thing. A healthy society depends on the freedom to ask questions, explore alternatives, and speak without fear of persecution. The information shared in this podcast represents the personal opinions and experiences of the guests and is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice and should not be relied upon as such. The host does not endorse or promote specific medical claims or treatments. Always seek the advice of qualified healthcare professionals with any questions regarding medical conditions or health decisions. The UK government and NHS state that COVID-19 vaccines authorised for use in the UK meet regulatory standards for safety, quality and effectiveness and are offered to those at higher risk. Any views expressed that differ from official guidance are personal opinions and should not be taken as medical advice. Listeners or viewers should consult NHS sources or healthcare professionals for individual health decisions. Hey everyone, and welcome to COVID Skeptics, a podcast that celebrates those true skeptics who stood up and spoke out against the COVID narrative, often at great personal and professional cost. This is an opportunity to hear their stories, what it was like to speak out at that time, whether they feel vindicated now, and what lessons we can learn moving forward. My name is Shirley Blanche, and today I'm really delighted to be joined by the wonderful Dr. Ros Jones. Ros is a retired consultant paediatrician with a special interest in neonatal intensive care and paediatric HIV. She has served on the advisory committee of the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit and on the Education and Training Committee of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Ros, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Shirley, for inviting me.
So let's just start off with, we can see that you're very well qualified, but I think for anybody listening, the pushback that you always get whenever anybody sort of speaks out against the narrative is you're not qualified enough to speak on this. So could you give everybody an idea about what your background is and what actually qualifies you to speak on this topic?
Right, yeah, well, I've had 40 years experience in the NHS as a paediatrician. I've also done, obviously, house jobs, medicine, surgery and obstetrics before going into paediatrics. And I, within the department where I was working, it was a big district general hospital. I sort of trained in teaching hospitals in Cambridge, the Hammersmith, Oxford, and then district hospital where I was working as a consultant. And in the last few years of my career, I was director for women and children's services, so that included the obstetric department as well. And also I landed up, because of that, being on pandemic preparedness planning committee for the swine flu in 2005, 2009. We were planning again. So it was quite interesting when it came to the beginning of COVID. I had lots of friends saying, you know, what's going to happen? What's the worst case scenario? And so I was aware of what the existing pandemic plans were. There was a lot of talk about how we had no preparation, and that really was patently not true. There were very good plans, and the last plan had been updated as recently as 2018. And the real problem, as far as I saw it, was that the plan just went out the window somewhere in March 2020 when we decided to follow the Chinese and try a plan that had never been trialled or assessed in anywhere at all.
So it's so interesting that you've actually got that background as well. So not only have you got your paediatric background, but you've also got the pandemic planning background as well. So you've really seen inside the machine and you really understand what goes into it as well. So I don't think anybody could say that you were coming from a conspiracy theory, anti-vaxxer background then.
No, I mean, obviously, as a paediatrician, I spent my whole career recommending vaccinations for children. I don't think I pushed them in the way that clearly, well, certainly, I mean, we'll come to the COVID vaccines because I've not seen anything like that in my career for a launch of a new vaccine, the way that was pushed. But, you know, I would have certainly recommended them. And I think getting into the beginning of COVID, we'll talk a bit about that and how the initial pandemic and the lockdown unfolded, because that's where I first began to think this is completely wrong. And then when it came to the vaccination of children, that's when I really thought I really, really have to speak out, because as a paediatrician, I've got that bandwidth to do it.
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? So take us back to, 2020, COVID's starting to happen. We're hearing more about it. What did your life look like then? What were you doing on a sort of daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, we were both fully retired. We were catching up with grandchildren, and I do quite a lot of singing. My husband plays quite a lot of golf. He plays the violin. We were doing just normal things, traveling, holidays, this, that, and the other. I'd done some traveling after I first retired, I'd gone with a group aligned to Mercy Ships doing safe obstetric teaching in countries in Africa. And in January 2020, we'd been to the Gambia teaching. So, and then something had come, and people were then at that point, there was a bit of talk about these 4 people had died of pneumonia in China. And I thought, well, hang on, out of a population of how many billion? It didn't seem to be anything much. And then gradually it started creeping up. And I think I got to the point, I got friends. I can remember, I was in a singing group with a bloke in his late 70s, and he was saying, when they were beginning to talk about lockdowns, and he was saying, this is utterly ridiculous. We all survived the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu, and if they think I'm not going to go into college to get my meals, they've got another thing coming. He was a bachelor academic, and he'd never cooked in his life. And I was saying, oh, no, but you need to take this really seriously, because when we'd done the original pandemic planning for the swine flu, and of course it was the same Neil Ferguson who'd done the same from Imperial, it was the same data. So the implication then was that 80% of the population would get swine flu. And so let's say we've got 60 million for the simplicity of the arithmetic, that's 50 million people are going to get it. And there might be 1 to 2% mortality. Well, if it's 2% mortality, that's a million deaths. But the problem, or if it's 1%, 500,000 deaths, that's the same as a year's worth of deaths, more or less. But the point is, it would be double that deaths, but it was all going to be compressed into about 12 weeks. It was going to go up and it was going to come down. And in our pandemic planning, it was very clear that we couldn't cope with that. The first week you would cancel the cold surgery and, you double up your beds for medicine. And by the second week, half the people who come in the first week weren't well enough to go home. And by the 4th week, we were expecting, this back from 2009, expecting we would have been completely overwhelmed. We'd sorted out to have extra mortuary space in refrigerated lorries down at Bracknell somewhere. It was all, there was a plan, but of course it didn't happen at all. So, there were a few extra cases here and there. There was nothing much. And I think back to the Hong Kong flu, I was a second-year medical student then. I asked around in March 2020 from our year group, can anybody remember this? Did we take extra precautions? Did we see where we all rushed off our feet? 80,000 people died of Hong Kong flu. But, I knew about it. It was mentioned. But there was no drama. So I think at the beginning, I sort of thought, I was saying, but this is, because I think they used the word SARS. That was such a psychological thing. Call this SARS-CoV-2. Well, SARS had been obviously quite scary. I knew somebody whose colleagues who died, who was working in Hong Kong at the time. So I think that made me more scared than I would have naturally been. And I think the other thing is, as a paediatrician, I wasn't used to being scared of infection, because that's your day job. You're going to work every day. If we saw a child with meningococcal sepsis, let's say, nobody would be rushing for a hazmat suit and saying, I can't see this child until I've put on all my gear. You just got on with it. And if you had to put a tube into a child who was sick and needed to be ventilated, you were right up close. But you didn't take even antibiotics after that. We gave them to the parents and the siblings, but the staff never took them. So I think we were used to dealing with infectious diseases and thinking that actually your immune system is pretty competent and most people can clear most infections most of the time. So I wasn't naturally scared. And I think actually at the time, of course, the weather was lovely and we were sitting out in the back garden and going for walks and feeling rather guilty that we weren't at work when all this was going on and our colleagues were clearly going to be snowed under. And I signed back on with the GMC because we got this opt-out, you got a letter saying if you don't want to sign up, you must say so. So I joined up back with the GMC. I got as far as having an online interview and doing my police checks, redoing my police checks. But having said that, it was very obvious early on that children were not really affected by this. And people say, oh, well, we didn't know enough, but we did, because China, all the deaths they were talking about, they didn't have any deaths in the under 10s. And in Italy, the average age of death was old. It was like they were in their 80s mostly, and the average age of death was older than the background average age of death. So we knew that before it even got to the UK. And yet somehow we suddenly went into this bizarre situation in the third week of March, when suddenly, having said we weren't locking down, then we did. And then at the beginning, this idea that the lockdown was to flatten the sombrero and all this. And it's interesting because the WHO at that time, again, their pandemic plan did not recommend lockdowns. And they specifically said the only excuse for a lockdown is if you're not prepared properly, you haven't got enough PPE or, protective gear or antibiotics or whatever you need, then you could lock down just for a few weeks to make sure you've got everything up and running. And I think it was put across originally was that the over 75s and people with serious comorbidities would shield for 12 weeks. And everybody else, it was just going to be 3 weeks, just enough to make sure that the NHS didn't kind of crash on its face. And then everybody else would go back out and go back to work. So I kind of accepted that. And so I have to say, we went shopping wearing gloves for about a fortnight and boiling them when we got back, and reusing them because we'd got some old surgical gloves left over from somewhere. But quite quickly we got to the point of thinking, no, this is bonkers, isn't it? Walking for country walks, trying to avoid putting your hand on a stile post in case somebody else
I remember those days.
Had coughed in their hand and put it on there and you're in broad sunshine. And then thinking, hang on, if I jump over this stile in the way that my husband would and could, I would land up with a broken ankle in the local casualty and catch COVID. This is stupid. So we quite quickly got to the point of thinking, all these rules, and you couldn't go and see family. And I think that's the other thing from my point of view. I've got the background experience professionally that made me, as a paediatrician, not worried about infections, and as a pandemic planner, so to speak, think, we need to be sensible about this. Lockdowns were never in those plans. School closures were never in those plans. And also that obviously in our retirement, what we were doing a lot of was meeting up with family and friends and so on. And the idea suddenly that I wasn't allowed to see my sister or my daughters or my grandchildren just felt very wrong. So when the schools shut, I thought, well, okay, they'll reopen at Easter because they shut it in March. And then after Easter, they didn't reopen. And that's when I really thought this is wrong. And then by May, they still weren't going back. And at that point, I joined Molly Kingsley and Liz Cole, asked for them to try and help to get schools reopened, because that seemed to me the first priority was to get schools reopened. That time, it didn't occur to me that they would start wanting to vaccinate children.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because you've got all this sort of experience, and what you're doing is you're using your reasoning and your experience, and you're not letting fear and emotion take over your reasoning. And I think potentially because you have your clinical experience, but also, with the swine flu, that was predominantly children, wasn't it? The demographic that was being affected. So that was a very different, if you'd been looking at a swine flu situation that you felt was going to get out of control, you could understand closing the schools if it was going to be contagious around children. I think what you said, which was really interesting as well, is, and that a lot of people don't always realise, is how much information was known early on. You had people like John Ioannidis, coming out with sort of what the fatality rate he recommended would be. You had other people sort of speaking out about that. So it wasn't that people didn't know, and this was a first step. And certainly I seem to remember with the briefings, and I didn't religiously watch them every day like some people did, because I was just sort of trying to stay away from some of the rhetoric and the fear. But I seem to remember that there was never really any mention. There was a lot of mention of herd immunity and how that was going to be the way forward. And to me, that just seemed like a really sensible option, that there would be people who would be vulnerable, and those people might need to protect themselves and shield. But that for the healthy population, it was going to be better. And then I seem to recall, for me personally as an observer, it seemed to be that there was some modelling that came out. And then I think there was a lot of pressure from maybe the teaching unions. Did you get that impression that there was, pressure?
When it came to reopening the schools, there was a lot of pressure, and we've got evidence of that. Because Gavin Williamson was the Minister for Education at the time, and he failed to stand up to the unions, I think, and what they were going to go back to school after half term in the end. And I think also, but at that point, the unions were pushing back hard about, it wasn't safe and this, that, and the other. And in the end, he sort of backtracked slightly and said, well, all head teachers know their own geography of their school and their personnel and so on. So I'll leave it up to the head teachers to do the planning and so on. And that was interesting because from my point of view, we've got grandchildren in different towns, and one lot went back to school the first day they were legally allowed to, so to speak, and within a fortnight, the head teacher had the whole school open with 1,000 pupils in there. And the other lot were at a school where they weren't ready to even take the one grandson who was theoretically eligible. They weren't ready. I mean, that's 3 months into lockdown. So he went back 2 weeks after lots of other schools had gone, thinking his brothers would follow him 2 weeks after that. But they spread them out in such a ridiculous way. They put 7 children in each room with one member of staff. So that meant they couldn't take the other 3 classes in because the first class had occupied all 4 classrooms. So they never went back. So 2 of my grandchildren went back the first day. The third one went back 2 weeks later, and the other 3 didn't go back till September. So they, and that made you think, well, if there's science, all this following the science, how is the science so different in one school from another? And the whole attitude and, the masking and everything else, and how strict and how horrible some, teachers were bawling children out of class who'd got a genuine mask exemption, asthmatics who were, wheezing and still told they couldn't take their mask off. And yet other teachers were just lovely and it was all fine. So, and that again was the fear propaganda. For people, how we all respond differently, depending on perhaps pre-existing vulnerabilities, etc. But I think, and that was the other thing, well, we'll probably come to, but I think which was so shocking about the whole management, because normally what a government's meant to do, you're meant to protect your citizens, and you're meant to reassure them and keep them calm, and, you're not meant to hype them up, wind them up to be more and more frightened. And it was very clear that there was no, I mean, you read Laura Dodsworth's book on the, state of fear, there was no exit strategy for the fear. They didn't seem to have realised that fear is a major detriment to your immune system, as well as to your mental health. So quite apart from the long-term mental health consequences, which have been huge, there was the worsening of your immunity, which is not great. Shutting you indoors when what you actually needed was vitamin D and sunshine and to be out and about. Yeah. And the idea of shutting children's playgrounds, I mean, again, we did a little survey for Us for Them. We were all asked to go down to our local playground and take pictures and so on. And our local playground was open, but 50% of playgrounds had that yellow and black ticker tape everywhere, and you couldn't use it.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people felt that they were following the science, but people like you who understood the science were sort of called conspiracy theorists, if you like. So you've had that whole training behind you, and you are really looking at the science. Where as a lot of other people are just being emotionally reactive. And I can understand that, because, you know, if you're being told that this is really deadly, if you're being scared, and fear was definitely used as a tactic, wasn't it? Because, you know, that's sort of come out since, and I spoke to Gary Sidley about that. You know, we could see that Matt Hancock was saying in WhatsApp messages about unleashing.
So, yes, we need to scare the pants off them, I think.
Yeah, to get people to be compliant. How much of it do you think was the response was just weak leadership in the government? Because, you know, they had a pandemic plan. Sweden obviously went in a different direction. They stuck with their pandemic planning. You'd obviously been involved in pandemic planning before. So there was an element of fear, but there was also an element of, I think, societal pressure. There was a pressure from the media. There was the modelling and all these sorts of things. So how much do you think was actually, it was the science that was being followed, or it was other pressures that were being followed? And do you think the government was just bowing to that? Or what do you think?
I don't actively blame the government, because if you look at the data coming to them from SAGE and the modelling and so on, there was nobody in the cabinet with a science degree, let alone any medical input. So it would be very hard for them to just ignore it. But I think when it comes to the who was pressing for what and why, and you look at the media and the mainstream media, I mean, the BBC were, you know, a propaganda tool, really, that's the only thing you could say. They were the mouthpiece of the government. Every time those press conferences, I did watch them fairly religiously, I have to say, for a long time, partly because I wanted to see what everybody else was seeing. But the journalists didn't ask probing questions. They barely at all. I mean, if there was anything, it was more about, well, why aren't you locking down already? Or what? It was all based on, we should do more harder. And the opposition, there was no such thing as an opposition, because they sort of said, oh, in this emergency, we must work together. But you need critical voices if you're to get sensible outcomes. And if you have a scientific community, because SAGE, they're self-select, you know, the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer who co-chaired it, Whitty and Vallance, they then select the committee according to what presumably the challenge might be. You choose who comes on, but there'll be people they know, and, you know, it's all very insular. And if you really want to get the best outcomes for any scientific project, you bring in different minds and you get questions. And, you know, when you're presenting a plan for a research project, you know, I was always taught you present it to the whole department really early on so they can all put it apart. You don't then spend loads of money and years doing a project and then you present it to them and they all say, oh, but why did you do it like that? You know. You have to have these critical questions early on, and they just didn't. But I think the trouble is, you look at what was happening around the rest of the world, and I think what was interesting is now, you know, 187 plus countries have all signed up to these new WHO pandemic agreements. The way Sweden behaved would now be illegal in the international law, because they've also signed. I thought they wouldn't sign. I really thought Sweden wouldn't sign. But they have. So, you know, the fact that all these countries did the same, to my mind, because a lot of people would say, oh, we must be doing the right thing because, look, everybody else is doing it. But at the one level, you think, is this really, you know, since when did Pakistan and India do the same thing at the same time? Or Gaza and, you know, Palestine and Israel? It just, everybody thinking we would follow this same lockdown, and the pressure to get the Black African countries who were struggling economically. They tried a bit of lockdowns in Kenya and very quickly backtracked because they realised their population would die of starvation. You know, they didn't have the furlough and all the stuff we've got. So they did fine. So, and when it came to the vaccine, the idea that we were pushing our excess vaccines, AstraZeneca, after all the trouble they had, and it got withdrawn from use in the UK very quietly, with nobody actually saying it's dangerous. It just stopped being available. You'd go, if you were getting a vaccine, you'd find they haven't got any AstraZeneca today, but we've got Pfizer. But they were pushing them to the third world. And I wouldn't have sold this stuff to my worst enemy. I really wouldn't.
So you were never, so we've established you were never anti-vax. You've not been that sort of person.
No, and I would have, to be honest, if they'd done a standard vaccine for COVID, I might well have taken it. But the only standard vaccine that they were going to bring along there was Valneva, and it was going to be made in Scotland. It was a French product. And then suddenly, in the middle of 2021, announced in the Commons that they'd withdrawn the contract, and the SNP were rather cross. But they never explained why.
No.
I went to a meeting that Andrew Pollard was speaking at, who's the professor in Oxford, he's the chairman of the JCVI, Joint Committee of Vaccine and Immunisations, but he also was the lead for the AstraZeneca trial. And at this meeting, I asked him, I said, I'm really curious why, when you were being asked to try and get a vaccine together, what made you choose a genetic technology with very minimal or no safety data rather than a standard vaccine? And his answer was speed. He said they're quicker to produce. So that seemed to be the only reason. And as you said quite early on, Chris Whitty was saying this virus is not dangerous enough for rushing a vaccine. And Ioannidis' work had shown this less than a 1% fatality rate is not appropriate for rushing something, but rush it they did. And it's interesting what's coming out now, because it was so conspiratorial to even call it a gene-based vaccine or a novel technology. The phrase novel technology landed you as a conspiracy theorist and with a fact checker taking your post down.
Yeah. And I have to say, we're going to try and upload this interview onto YouTube. And I'm sure that a lot of people will look at this. And I have to sort of say, obviously, a lot of people disagree with what you say. A lot of people still say that the vaccines are safe and effective and that they saved millions of lives. A lot of people still really believe in that. A lot of people still believe that they were protected by the vaccines, and that they would have died had they not been vaccinated. It was interesting what you said about the Valneva, because that was the one that I was personally waiting for, because I thought if we're all going to have to get vaccinated, that's the one. I have a history of a very rare health condition, which means I have to be very careful about the sort of medications that I take. And so that's what I got started to sort of research and look into. Started to do my own research, which you're not allowed to do, of course.
Oh, you're not meant to do that. No, don't do your own research.
You're not allowed to do that. So you were there. You're in 2020. You've had a nice retirement. It was the school closures that really sort of pulled you into thinking, I've got to speak up. You got involved with Us for Them, which is a great organisation speaking up for children, because I think one of the worst things that I saw as the outcome of the adults' fear was the way that the adults' fear was projected onto the children, and the children were made to feel responsible for the health of the adults. And I always felt like, as a society, we were there to protect children, not the other way around. And to me, it seemed like that there was this weird inversion of that during the pandemic, driven by fear. And I understand. I have a lot of empathy for people that are afraid, because it is, you don't think clearly. Your brain isn't working properly when you're in a state of fear. And so you can sort of behave in ways that you wouldn't normally when you are fearful. So
that's the problem with the exaggeration of the fear, because even now, if you ask people for different age groups what was the likely death rate, so to speak, and I've got quite a good graph which I could put up, but if you'd like it, I'll send it you. But just by age group, and even the over 90s, there was still less than 5% died of COVID. And I think most people would have assumed that if you were 90, you would just definitely 100%, you would die of COVID.
Yeah.
I had a friend and colleague who'd had a chronic lung disease condition, and she was really wary of meeting us because we weren't vaccinated, because she'd been told that if she got COVID, she would die. And I thought, well, that's really weird, because even if we assume COVID 4 times as bad as flu, let's say, she'd never been told she had a 25% mortality rate from flu. She'd never worried about that before. And yet somehow she allowed herself to believe that if she'd caught COVID, she would die. And that was never going to be true, ever, ever.
And so you got involved with Us for Them, but you started sort of speaking out a little bit more, didn't you? Because I saw you on various podcasts and being interviewed at a time when very few people in the medical establishment were speaking out. Why do you think, if you're sort of saying, so to play devil's advocate, if you're sort of saying, well, I've got this background and I understand the way it works and I understand the science, I think the pushback that you would get was, well, all the other scientists seem to disagree with you. So why do you think that more scientists didn't speak out? Do you think it was because you were able to speak out because you were retired, or do you think it was just the pushback that you would get? I mean, did you get pushback? What was your experience like?
I got a bit. I got more. It was just that people ignored it. It wasn't really active pushback. We didn't lose any friends over it. We didn't lose any family contacts. Nothing like that. I think most of the, people who saw things I put up online, of course, on the whole, other people are looking in the unusual bits of the media. Then that's the thing. And I've got into Twitter and things for helping us for them uploading stuff. I'd never done Twitter before in my life. Facebook, I wasn't in Facebook. I had none of these things. So I landed up having to it was a steep learning curve for the social media, and I would love to come off it again. I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate the fact that my phone, I open it in the morning and I've got hundreds of emails and hundreds of different WhatsApp groups, Telegram groups, etc. But I kind of felt obliged to do it because I think if you were working, there's two reasons. I think one was you're just very bound up in it and you're busy and you don't have the time to step back and think, really? But also, they were a huge risk work-wise from speaking out. And it's interesting because in 2021, a group set up called Doctors for Patients UK, and they've been very supportive. There were a lot of doctors who joined that who had felt totally alone. They had no idea there was anybody else who agreed with them. And at the beginning, there was this idea that they would all do like maybe a 1-minute clip of why they were worried about the vaccines or what they were seeing in their practice. And there were 120 people here. Grew very quickly over the first few weeks because everybody brought along a friend or contact somebody they thought was vaguely waking up to the awfulness of the vaccine injuries. But when it came to it, there were only 20 people who were prepared to make the video clip, which included 3 of us who were retired, who'd originally said we wouldn't because that wasn't the point. The point was to get people who were working. And then they said, oh, please do because we haven't got enough. And then we had people who sort of did it and then they felt nervous about it going out. So they said, could it come off again? And, one who led the video originally, a GP who was the first person on this clip, was lovely, but her family were appalled and said, not so much because they disagreed with what she was saying, but how could you put your job at risk by saying it? So I think, the chances of me somehow losing my NHS pension over this, I thought they can't really do that, I don't think. But if they did, well, that, sorry.
So it's really interesting. So it was not so much that they maybe disagreed with the science, although, or your perspective around the science, if you like, which scientific debate has always been encouraged. I always felt that scientific debate was always encouraged in science. And for me, it was weird as an outsider just to not hear two sides of the debate. So my brain, I think, is always looking for two sides of the argument so that I can make an informed decision. And that goes back to informed consent, doesn't it, really? So it wasn't necessarily that they were necessarily disagreeing with your perspective around the science. It was just that there was so much social pressure at that time. And I think we're almost at risk now of forgetting how intense that pressure was. Do you think that people didn't take you as seriously because you're retired? Was there an element where you weren't given as much credibility because of that?
I did one or two. I did one on GP News with some vaccine professor from somewhere, and it was almost, who was that? I'd gone on first, and then the commentator actually said, so who was that old woman, or something like that? I can't remember. I just thought, you've asked me to come on this programme. You know my qualifications, or you shouldn't have been interviewing me in the first place. But it was like she hadn't bothered to see who I was before she'd interviewed me. And then the person who came on afterwards was obviously totally disagreeing with me because they weren't side-by-side interviews, they were one after the other. And obviously whenever you got onto something where you were the controversial one, they always put the mainstream one afterwards. So that was the take-home message, was that everything she'd said was wrong. So I got a bit of that, but I think what was interesting was at the point, as I said, where I realised that I got to speak out about the vaccines, and I have to say, and Molly wouldn't mind me saying this, at that point, they were really getting traction about the schools, and they'd got, the person who ran the parliamentary group for education, Robert Halfon MP, was being very supportive, and she was very worried about touching the vaccines at that point, which I understood. And I actually moved back from us for them because I thought I have to do this, and we set up a separate group called the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group. And I started off writing letters to I went to an FDA meeting. Peter Doshi managed to get me onto that. They have their meetings where they discuss these things. And you got a 3-minute slot to say what your worries were. But at that point, it wasn't being approved here for children. And then it was obviously going to come, and I knew Pfizer had put in an application. So I thought, we have to get on with this. So the first open letter we did, I got 50 signatures. The Telegraph published it in full. We wrote to the MHRA in May 2020. So that was before they'd authorised this vaccine for children at all. And they didn't reply. And eventually, I rang her secretary, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll make sure it's on her desk." And then she'd said, I got the reply 2 hours after they'd approved it. And the reply came just saying, obviously, we've looked at all the data from Pfizer and it's fine. So don't worry your heads about it. But we'd already sent a copy to the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation, and they had replied straight away saying, well, it's not up to us, it's the MHRA. So then obviously I wrote back to them. We sent a supplementary letter with a lot more concerns and said, you cannot assume the MHRA have done their due diligence, because they hadn't. The only data they'd looked at, and they shared this, it's public, the only data they'd looked at was what was provided by Pfizer from the trials. And my point when I'd gone on this meeting in the US was that those countries that had approved it earlier, like the States and Israel particularly, we needed to see what was happening there. And I landed up on Zoom call to a team in Israel who were really helpful. And I just emailed them because I'd seen something I've never thought in this stage of retirement I'd be seeing something that was in the Jerusalem Post relayed by Reuters, and then someone say, "Oh, Ros, have you seen this?" About the myocarditis in the children in Israel, who were teenagers who were getting this. And for 15 to 19-year-olds getting a Pfizer vaccine, their risk for myocarditis was 10 times higher than for a 30 to 35-year-old. But of course, their risk from COVID would have been 10 times lower. So the risk-benefit balance was 100 times worse for teenagers to take the vaccine than for 30-year-olds. So they came up with a risk of 1 in 6,000, which is quite high if you're talking about 1 in 2 million risk of dying of COVID. It doesn't balance out. You're always looking, any drug, all drugs have side effects, but you're always looking at that balance. You want the benefits to be better than the side effects. And if you get to the point where actually there's no benefit to be had because the disease is so mild it's irrelevant, and ironically, the side effects are worse in children, a lot of them, probably because they've got a more efficient immune system. They fight, when they get the vaccines, they'll get more inflammatory response. And so it very quickly became obvious this was not remotely in children's interest. And then, of course, we got onto the thing that, as you've already mentioned, this upside-down approach to protection of who's protecting who. And there were adverts, and I picked a picture of a terrible advertisement in Cornwall for, there was it was a two-way family photo because it had the granny with the white hair and the 7-year-old sitting on her lap. And the thing was, bring your child for vaccination to protect granny. And you thought, there's a mum in this. They haven't put her in the picture, but this poor mum, she's being torn both ways. Because, of course, she loves her mother and wants to protect her nice 75-year-old mother. But also, she's hugely responsible and loves her 7-year-old daughter. And for me, the idea that my grandchildren might be expected to put their own long-term health at risk to give me a bit of extra time. I've had my 70 years and 10, and I love some more, but I'm not entitled to think other people should put their lives at risk for me.
I completely agree. And this is the thing that still baffles me and actually makes me feel a bit physically sick when I think about it, was the fact that adults were using children to protect them. I think you make some really good points there, which I just want to go over. That every drug has risk reward. You don't ever universally give any sort of treatment to everybody the same. You always weigh up your own personal, risk and reward benefits, and there may be some people out there that did benefit from being vaccinated early on. Certainly somebody might give different advice to a morbidly obese person in their 80s to a young and healthy 15-year-old child. I think I completely agree with you. I mean, I've always said to my children, if there's a virus that ever comes out that only kills people that are 5'2" called Shirley, I still don't want you to be vaccinated to protect me from it, because that's not your job. Can you explain for people, the MHRA is the what does that stand for?
It stands for the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority.
And it's their job, isn't it, to sort of make sure that we're being protected, so that it's their job to really supposed to scrutinise drugs that come before them, to make sure that they're only approving drugs that have met sort of certain safety limits and have been proved to be safe. The JCVI, though, are they what's the difference between, are they're like a government body, are they?
Yes, they're also a sort of government body. They're within the Department of Health, I think, probably indirectly responsible to. So their job is to look at the policy. So just because a product is licensed doesn't mean it's recommended for everybody. So vaccines in particular, they have this group that look at and decide what will go on the schedule. So it was they who drew up this list. If you remember the way it came, it started with the over 80s and people in care homes. And then the next group was over 75s and healthcare workers. And then it was over 70s and with comorbidities and so on. And it went all the way down, and then it got to everybody over 50 or with comorbidities that had it. And that was level 9. And I think that originally the thought was that where it's going to stop. But then they sort of got onto this juggernaut that they somehow thought, and I think they got spare doses too, that they would just go on down and give it to healthy young adults. So they approved it, and it's interesting looking at their minutes. I think they did try. They obviously were worried about children. I'm not saying about the young adults because I didn't look at all of that, but for children, they clearly they'd had Zoom meetings with the same group in Israel that I talked to. They'd also had a Zoom meeting with cardiologists in the States, who again, I got a Zoom call and talked to the same group. So I know what they were being told. That thing I showed you about this 1 in 6,000 myocarditis for Israeli adolescent boys, they were slides that the guy said, to his research assistant, can you send Dr. Jones the same slide set we sent to the other English group? And then I sort of, when we got us on a Zoom call, I said, so I presume that was the JCVI? And they said, yes. So I know I'd got the same data. And the minutes of their meetings, they clearly were quite worried. And they actually said, the first meeting after the MHRA had approved it, they took 6 weeks to even say, we're not approving it for under 18s. We do not think that the risk balance, benefit balance is too close to call. So they didn't approve it. And within 48 hours, they were being asked to hold an emergency meeting by the chief medical officer to reconsider their decision. So they were asked to have another look at it. So they then had another meeting at which they then said, all right, well, let's give it to 16 and 17-year-olds, but not below that. And they slightly broadened the comorbidities that were eligible. And then they had another meeting at the beginning of September with cardiologists, this big round table, and that's minuted. And at the end of that, they then had another meeting on their own to just say, what are we going to do? And they asked for another 6 months to look at the follow-up data from the cases from myocarditis from these other countries. But that, there was such pressure to get on with this. And then they sort of I think they were a bit weak because they then handed it to the chief medical officers, and they didn't need to do that. They said, we can't look at anything other than direct health benefits. But they had, when they turned it down earlier on in July, they talked about societal things. They talked about whether it was being transmitted in schools. The evidence was that schools were not acting as a sort of centre for reinfection. because actually it was less likely to be passed between children than it was from adults to children, or adults to adults. So they'd done it before, but this time I think they were just under too much political pressure. So they decided to pass the buck to the CMOs, and the CMOs then sort of came up with this bizarre idea that they would recommend it for children's mental health.
Yeah, that's...
How do you work that one out? Well, that was because they'd said, if you agree, which by then they clearly had, the very blaringly obvious, which was that if you close schools, that will be bad not only for children's education, but also for their mental health. They therefore used school closures as the excuse for saying, we need to have the vaccine to keep schools open, and that'll be good for their mental health. But what was so daft was in the summer term of 2021, you may remember this time was when we had this so-called pingdemic, because everybody had got these blooming apps, and you could walk into a shop and you'd suddenly get an app saying you've been near someone with COVID.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you've got to isolate and so on.
I've forgotten about
that. One of our granddaughters got sent home, the whole of her year group with 5 classes, 150 children were sent home from one child that she didn't know who he was, and he wasn't in her class, the whole going home. So all of that. There were 1 million children out of school because not of COVID, but of COVID policy. And they then changed that policy at the end of July, 3 days after the summer term, or before, just at the time the summer term ended. So actually, when they came back in September, they didn't need to vaccinate children to stop the school closures, because they'd already done the thing they needed, which was to scrap this batty policy. And they'd said from then on, children only had to isolate if they were ill. And if they weren't ill, they could come to school.
Because the other myth I think that still exists is that it stopped transmission.
Yeah.
And I think some people still actually believe that it reduced transmission, and yet I don't know that they were ever tested for that.
They weren't. And I think the other thing, which was a bit of a myth, because for quite a long time, still up until last year, children could get a vaccine if they were healthy, but they lived in a household with somebody with immunosuppression. So again, if your granny was sick and you lived there, you should get it. But what they never made much of was actually, and there's very good data on this, including from Public Health England, that in the first week after vaccination, you are more likely to get COVID than later. There's always this little upturn before it went down.
What is that? That's really interesting, because I do know a couple of people who did get COVID straight after they'd been vaccinated.
And they said it couldn't happen because it wasn't a live vaccine. But I presume it's because of the immunosuppression. So presumably COVID's around, this virus is around, it's out and about. And you might have had some up your nose, but you wouldn't have, your innate immune system would have just ignored it and dealt with it. But as soon as you get your vaccine, your white blood counts drop, your lymphocytes drop, your T cells drop, and that is not good for dealing with this virus if it's around. So you're more likely to get COVID in that first week. There was something very early on that they realised that when they were starting to roll the vaccine out to NHS staff and care workers, there was a suggestion that they should take a week off work in order to not risk bringing COVID into the work. Because the whole reason they were being vaccinated was to protect their patients. Yeah. So it was illogical to give them something that would actually make them more risky to their patients. Yeah. But then that was debated, and they said, we can't do that because that would give such a mixed message. It would make people think that the vaccine was going to make them ill. So they never did that. But, if you were going to get a child vaccinated to protect Granny, then in theory what you should do is make sure Granny goes off to stay with a, different daughter-in-law this week while your children are vaccinated and doesn't come back till 2 weeks later. But of course nobody ever said that to anyone.
And the other thing that sort of bothers me as well is when you look at the risks that you're asking young people to take and children to take who've got their whole lives ahead of them, is that you're looking at the vaccine compensation scheme, which is that you have to be, I think, if I'm right, you have to be disabled more than 60% to qualify for it. And it's £120,000 payment, which if you think, well, if you're sort of in your 80s and you're not very well, and you get an adverse event, and that's one thing. But if you're a young person, you've got your whole life ahead of you. 120,000 isn't going to get you very far. Yeah. And so again, you know, if you were that convinced that it was safe and effective, you would have happily said, well, you know, take it, you know, we'll shield you from all side effects, and there's unlimited, you know, unlimited compensation that you can claim. Yeah. But the fact that you can't, I think, you know, that is a really important risk that people need to be aware of. Yeah.
I think that's true. I mean, we've paid out probably 20, I mean, very few people have had the payments so far. I mean, some have. It's even worse in the States, I think. And also the other thing, which I think, if you bought a car and the brakes failed, you wouldn't sue the Ministry of Transport. You'd sue, you know, Vauxhall or Ford or, you know, whoever you bought your car from, the car manufacturer. But somehow vaccines are the only, or other drugs, the drug manufacturers are liable for side effects and things, but not for vaccines. And it's the same in the States. They've got this unlimited indemnity, which is then covered by the government. Then the government set up this rather pathetic vaccine compensation scheme, which, as you say, I mean, one of the guys who had a leg amputated for a clot in his groin, he was turned down because they said that's not 60% disability. Yeah.
It's terrible. It's
really terrible. It's just horrendous, really.
So looking at your experience, and you've done, you know, you've been involved with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Yeah. The organisations like that, did they speak out during that time?
I mean, they were quite disappointing. I mean, I think at the beginning it was again interesting. The college the website was very good at the beginning at being calming, telling parents who might look on the website, you know, this is a disease that's very mild in children. There was one inflammatory condition that occasionally landed children up in intensive care, but it was very rare. And also the evidence was they made a full recovery after it. So please don't be too worried about it. And I think there were 3 healthy children died in the whole of 2020 to 2021, 2 complete winter peaks. 6 healthy children died, 3 of COVID and 3 of this inflammatory post-COVID syndrome. So they were very reassuring. And when the vaccines were first being discussed, they were very clear that if you had a child with a severe comorbidity, it's a sort of child who's been in and out of intensive care when they've had previous pneumonias, that sort of condition, a spastic quadriplegia with a, you know, wonky spine, who's at really high risk of respiratory illness. And they said, but, you know, you must be aware that there's no trial data for vaccines for these children, but talk to your own paediatrician and, you know, they arrange to get you vaccinated. But there was never a push at all. But then as soon as the day that the CMOs approved it for children, or recommended it for children, and the Secretary of State, who was by then Sajid Javid, approved it, the college turned and seemed to think it was the bee's knees, and they didn't push back. And they did a bit of pushing back about the testing in schools, but not enough, really, I don't think. They knew it was wrong. They knew that children's mental health was being impaired. And they did speak out a bit, but I don't think they didn't really stamp their feet hard enough and say, look, we're the college protecting children, and this is wrong.
So I'm curious, because you obviously come from this medical background. That's been most of your life has been spent in medicine, and you've had now this experience of COVID, speaking out, getting pushback. How's this changed your view of the world, the NHS? I mean, has it changed the way that you see everything now? Are you a different person now than pre-COVID? Has it changed your worldview?
Yes, I think it's a simple answer. Yes, I mean, I think it's been a real eye-opener. It's been a great disappointment. I think things that I thought were good, and I think the trouble is one can get so to the point where you don't trust anybody for anything, and that's not healthy either. But I'm much more generally sceptical. You know, I would really want to look at any data. I'll always go to the supplements and so on, all that. You know, if you just read the abstract, you'll get, again, we've seen so many papers where the abstract gives a completely different message, even from the results section, let alone if you go to the supplements and you find the tables which show that, you know, like you take the original trial, Pfizer trial, there were more deaths in the vaccine arm than the placebo arm. Well, that doesn't come across, does it? No. Talk about safe and effective. The whole idea is it's going to make. Yes, there were less deaths of COVID. There was 1 death of COVID in the vaccine arm and 2 in the placebo. So they say, 50% reduction in deaths. But then there were more deaths, cardiovascular deaths in the vaccine arm than the placebo, which were presumably vaccine side effects. So all of that, I've become much more sceptical. And I think of lots of other aspects of politics. So, I've always been I've been interested in politics, but I've never been particularly involved, and it certainly made me much more aware of how appalling the political systems are, really.
Were you surprised that the pushback came from the right more than the left? Because that was something that surprised me a bit. I was thinking that the left were always a bit more, supportive of. I suppose I'm traditionally liberal. Well, I always sort of thought the left were maybe a bit more liberal, and I thought there'd been pushback from the opposition, and I would have thought that it would have been, so that's what surprised me, because I always felt that the right were more authoritarian and the left was a bit more liberal. But
yes, but I think the problem, if you look in politics, is that you can go, you can be in the middle and try and be reasonable and thinking about things. And you can go a bit to the right or a bit to the left and still be trying to think about things. But once you go round the back, totalitarianism is the same. It doesn't make any difference whether it was fascism or communism. Yeah. Those sort of regimes, and what their playbook is, and that's what's really changed my view, I think, is censorship is number one. Book burning, we think of, and it's, you're talking about, will this get up on YouTube? I think hopefully it will, because I think things are better now than they were in some ways. But, you've now got the online harms bill. All this stuff, is changing by the month. And what will happen with the new WHO treaty, etc. And, I was certainly quite surprised to discover that I and all the signatories to our original letter to the MHRA had that passed to the Counter Disinformation Unit. It's been quite interesting, because when I tell some colleagues about that, it's one of the things that actually wakes them up slightly, because they know that I shouldn't be on some Counter Disinformation Unit file. So 8 professors and, all of us, the whole lot. And it was done by the Department of Health. Because it didn't happen straight away. It wasn't the MHRA. It was when we sent the copy to the chief medical officer, because we've got the date because we all did subject access review, and the date that because they had to tell you who'd given them this information. So the information was our letter, and the date they received it and who they received it from. They received it from the Department of Health and Social Care, and it was the day after we'd sent a copy of the letter to Chris Whitty. And, I find that is pretty worrying. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But the only thing I feel quite optimistic about is that generally a lot of people, I think, have woken up to the manipulation that goes on, the politicking, the way we're all being manipulated through the fear propaganda and so on, I think was quite an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I think they look back now and think, God, we all joke about, the rule of 2 and the rule of 6, take away the number you first thought of. It was all so nonsensical. And we all know that the masks were nonsense, because you can see people, they pull them down to their chins, but even if they're wearing them apparently correctly, you had all those things where somebody did a thing where they took a vape and you could see smoke coming over the top there and around and I often say to people, if your glasses steam up when you're wearing a mask, then it's not working. Yeah. And if you wear glasses and a mask, your glasses steam up. But I still think that if we get another scare pandemic created or declared by the WHO, and if another time they say that the mortality rate is higher, then I suspect that an awful lot of people at the moment are they want to move on, because they know they were a bit silly and they fell for a lot of nonsense. And particularly tragic is for the people who've got vaccine injury, and I just feel so awful, because at one level I feel I should have shouted louder. But then I think if I shouted louder, I'd have got taken down. And my job as a paediatrician was to speak up for children, and the adults had to take care of themselves. And I suppose the only thing I know I got nowhere with the regulators, and I got myself referred to the CDU, but I do think we had an impact for parents. And I've had parents just, total strangers coming up to me, recognise me and just said, want to give me a big hug and thank me, because they said their gut instinct was not to vaccinate the children, but they were under so much pressure, peer pressure, teachers, school, doctors, whoever. And it was just really helpful to see somebody who was qualified and who all the letters we wrote, they were always fully referenced. And I've done a statement, I did a witness statement for the UK COVID-19 at their request. But at the end of the day, I wasn't called as a witness. I wasn't surprised, really.
What do you think is going to come of that?
I don't know, nothing much. It'll just get... it's just kicking the can down the road, isn't it? And the feeling of the whole thing when you watched a lot of the interviews was that they'd already decided that really certainly lockdowns surely should have been done harder, faster. The fact
that's the impression I get.
They even did suggest that they would have to wear masks for the inquiry, would be routine mask wearing. Well, this inquiry started a year, 18 months after masks had been dropped. Yeah. So where was that coming from?
So looking back over the time, from the person you were then to now, everything you've had to go through, all the social media, going from your quiet, nice retirement to everything you've said, any regrets? Would you do it all again?
Oh, I'd do it all again, yes. I've met some lovely people, and I think I was talking yesterday to John Campbell on the phone about something, and then today he rang me back for a query about something. And I didn't say it at the time, but I came off the phone thinking, here I am, I'm 77 and I'm learning something new every day. And that is such fun. I'm just learning new stuff all the time. He rang me about something about iodine and I couldn't answer his question. But, all the time, there's so much to keep your brain active. And I'm still doing lots of other stuff. I'm managing to keep it more or less in a balance. I'm not spending all waking hours on it. But there was a time where I was working, probably 40 hours a week on it.
And that's
the other thing which really annoys me. One is the thing of saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. But the other slur that gets passed is this thing called grifters. And I didn't know what a grifter was. I had to look it up in some dictionary. But, the idea is that we're all on the make. Yeah. Well, I haven't made any money out of this. None of us haven't. There's some people, for me, I didn't give up any finance. I just gave up a bit of time that would have been spent doing other nice things. But a lot of people who've given up, who've lost their jobs over this, the last thing they've done is gained anything. But if you write a book, then you're a grifter, despite the fact that you've had no income for 4 or 5 years. And that's just... And to my mind, if you want to look at, without wanting to be too conspiratorial about the whys and wherefores, the simplest thing is follow the money. And if you look at who's made the money out of this, the drug industry have made, trillions. And the elite, the money, the difference in wealth between the poor and the rich, the lockdowns themselves, the transfer of money, the number of billionaires has got more. And the number of people who are going to food banks has also got more. Yeah. And that's not right.
No. Ros, you've been so generous with your time. I'm so grateful, just personally grateful for everything that you did during the pandemic, speaking up, because I know it's difficult. You've got a reputation. You've been you've had this amazing career and you have a reputation, and when you speak up against the narrative, you do risk that reputation. And so I do think you sort of underplay how brave it is to actually speak up on these things. I'm so grateful that you've agreed to be interviewed today, and I'm just thankful that you were one of those people that spoke up. Thank you so much. Any last little message you'd like to give to anybody that might want to speak up themselves, or any little word of advice?
Well, I do think it is the right time. I think if all the health professionals who were seeing harms actually spoke out, we could get this vaccine taken down. And I think the trouble is, a lot of people think, oh, well, COVID vaccine, it's being quietly dropped, let's face it. If you look at the guidance for this autumn, it's going to be over 75s and those with immune deficiency only. It's got not even pregnancy on there now. And we haven't talked about the fertility issues.
Yeah.
Pregnancy, and I'm finding that extremely worrying. I'm doing some work with the Lighthouse Declaration on fertility issues. But I think it's the worry is that they're pushing on with all this vaccine technology for all the other, all the other ordinary vaccines are all long since off patent. So there's money to be made, and we've got this huge Moderna factory now outside Oxford with government money for 10 years, government funding for them. And they have got loads of these vaccines coming online that they're trialling. And I think the mRNA technology itself is fundamentally risky in a way that, I'm not saying there aren't some side effects with all vaccines, but I think this has its particular, the fact that it's a genetic method which has no off switch. So most people are fine, but a proportion of people will go on making spike protein for years with these long-term side effects. And that's, again, most drugs, if you stop taking them, the side effects tend to go away. But the idea that you've had something just one dose and you're then in constant pain, and 4 years later you're still in constant pain, I mean, it just must be so daunting. So I think if you're well, if you've had these vaccines and you're well, I wouldn't spend too much time dwelling on, because I think there's a lot of saying, scaremongering, ticking bomb, and all this, and I think that's very unhelpful. I agree. The main message is keep yourself healthy generally, get out in the sunshine, fresh air, exercise, eat healthily, meet up with friends and family, and just be more skeptical next time they will try and do this again, undoubtedly. Keep hold of cash, keep spending cash, try and avoid getting onto digital ID. I think the closing date for response to that was probably today. So, it's also entangled, all of this. And I think we just have to, at the same time, keep our feet on the ground and not let it get too all-consuming, because that's not good for your health or your joie de vivre.
I think that's some brilliant advice. It's been so interesting talking to you. Thank you so much for giving me your time today. Thanks everybody for listening as well. I look forward to catching up with you again soon. In the meantime, do take care. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.